Just give you a kind of a budget update from the standpoint of you've been seeing our bills have come out of, we're publishing them as quickly as we can get them prepared and finalized within our caucus. So the economic growth budget, the admin budget, and the agriculture budget have moved out of budget subcommittee to go to the full appropriations committee. Our objective would be, hopefully this week, if not early next week, we'd have all of our budgets released, our general fund budgets released by that time, sometime next week. As you look at our number, it'll be 966 billion will be our total number. It's roughly $153 million increase to the general fund in our budgets. So that's going to start becoming more and more of a conversation. Once we hopefully get those all to the full appropriations committee, we'll start making decisions on whether we want to move them further at that point. But you're starting to see the wheels turn a little bit over here on the House, and the budgets that we released would reflect where we are at this point from the House's perspective. We didn't release shell bills or the governor's bills. Those are our bills where we stand today. So I'll just kind of open with that and then turn over to you guys.
And that's a little less than 2%?
Yeah, I think it's right around 1.61, 1.62, right in that range.
Okay.
There were discussions on getting HHS numbers as you move forward with that budget. Have those questions been resolved?
I think my understanding, I haven't had my plan is yet today, hopefully have a conversation with Representative Moore, Representative Meyer. My expectation is it sounds like we've made progress on getting some of those answers to the questions that we want. Again, that's one of the bills that takes longer to draft, and some of those questions we were waiting to have resolved. I think my expectations would be we would want to feel comfortable that we've had enough answers to move forward, so that would be part of that conversation. Yeah.
Yesterday, Senator Dawson said passage of the property tax plan in the Senate was the first step toward compromise. What is your second step, perhaps?
Well, I think we're still trying to figure out what that exactly looks like at this point. Obviously, we have a bill out there that we feel is very pro-taxpayer, putting certainty for the taxpayer. We're trying to make a decision yet internally as a caucus. We've talked about it again yesterday as a full caucus, see what our next step may be. I think you'll see us in a position where that bill will likely go to the Ways and Means Committee, and then at that point, whether we amend on our bill or what we consider to be further compromise. You know, we did amend our original bill in committee. We maybe would we want to look at what a further compromise would be, but I think it is productive for the process to start getting a bill over to the House, and then we start seeing where we can find places to have a level of compromise.
With their amendment to their bill yesterday, does that move the needle anywhere closer to common ground?
I'm going to be really honest with you, that was a very significant amendment that came out yesterday. I've not had a chance to fully digest what that would look like, but that's what our plan is, to try to get us in a better position to understand where those changes were made and see where we are on all those, but I have not had an opportunity to digest that. It was a pretty significant amendment.
Isn't there still the issue of do you touch the rollback or not? I mean, is that because that seems to be very important to the Senate, that is changed and it's not in your plan.
Yeah, I mean that is one of the major pieces that's out there yet. We're still trying to see what the impacts would be. Our objective all along has been, and I said it once today and I continue to say it, is making sure we're getting certainty back on the side of the taxpayer. Anything that would be done in any of the bills that looks like it could have a potential tremendous shift to other properties, I think we've been a little bit hesitant to. I'm not saying that necessarily would be the case, but that is going to be one of the things that we figure out if there is a middle ground or a way to resolve that. That is obviously going to be a thing. That's a thing for the rest of figuring this property tax bill out.
The Senate's proposal doesn't include the 2% cap that the House and the governor both wanted. Is that something that you're not willing to kind of compromise on?
Yeah, on the 2%. So the Senate bill and excuse me, we have some friends joining us today, I see. On the 2% cap that we have in our bill and the governor's bill is just a flat cap. The bill that's in the Senate would be, again, I'm saying this before the amendment, so if that changes, I don't want to be looking like I'm not up to date here, but having any sort of a CPI or rolling number with that, I think we've been pretty clear in the House that whatever that number is, we want to make sure it's static. So that's, again, one of the sticking points that has to be settled on. Whatever that revenue cap is going to look like, we want to make sure that it's set and not having some sort of rolling number or rolling amount involved.
Why wouldn't you want to give cities or counties some flexibility when inflation does go up and down? And are you worried that we heard some local government representatives say that would force them to cut public safety budgets?
Well, I think naturally that's the first thing we're always going to hear when it comes to public safety. I think one of the things that we've been pretty clear about, if we do not have set levels, whether it's 2% or whatever those are, I don't think you're really going to see our delivery of services change. and I've said this the entire session, I really believe right now the system is set up that local entities decide how much money we need, we tax at that level, and then we figure out how we're gonna spend it versus how much is the taxpayer willing to put into the coffers and how can we become more efficient. I've had conversations with folks in my district and elected officials that they think that there are opportunities for them to do things differently, but you know, whether it's working with other counties and things, but right now, the way the system works, the revenue has been there to be able to not have to make some of those decisions. So we do recognize that is gonna be not necessarily something that it just happens overnight, just fixes all of those efficiencies, but it's something that local government has to start looking at becoming more efficient. And we're already hearing some ideas being, you know, that local governments are already having conversations about pooling of health insurance and things. So I think some of these conversations are already leading to that before we've even passed a bill.
Part of the bill would be making significant changes to the gas tax, including increasing that. Is that something that the caucus has discussed? Do you have any idea? Is that something that you support?
Yeah, and I think, so there was a reason why we didn't have it in our original bill. We wanted the focus to be on the property tax side of things. I understand from the Senate's perspective, they've had that in their bill since the beginning. I think it's an appropriate, if we are going to have this conversation as a legislature and we have not fully vetted it, like I said, just getting the bill, we have not gone over and fully vetted it in caucus, full disclosure. But that is going to have to, it's an appropriate place to have that conversation, whether or not our caucus feels that it is the right time to have that conversation. I don't think we've landed in a position on it, but I recognize why the Senate sees this. If we're going to be limiting revenue to local governments, looking at some of those key things that they're expected to fund, I think it's not an inappropriate place to have that conversation.
Randy Feenstra made some comments this week about the ESA program, saying that private schools should have to accept every student. I know some members of your caucus have had feelings about that. I wonder if you have thoughts about whether private schools should have that requirement.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, I'll answer this one time because I don't want to become, every time one of the candidates on either side says something, I have to respond to it. But I think naturally you saw some of the members of our caucus have a little bit of a disagreement with that statement that was being said. You know, I know members of the caucus have had conversations with Congressman Feenstra since that point in time. I would just say, you know, we feel the program is working really well right now. Clearly, it has a tremendous amount of usage within the program. And so again, what comments that other candidates are making, especially when they're not in the State House, probably not going to want to weigh in on too much. So.
Do you have any thoughts on the Senate passed a bill that would regulate the prediction markets, whether that's something that your caucus would support? Yeah,
we're still working through that. You know, there's some arguments on both sides. We know whether it's working its way through the courts, what that looks like. I think at this point it's way too early from our perspective to know if there is something to be done, what would even be the right path, or whether states should be doing something at this point in time. I think that's a pretty tricky issue with how it ties in with the Fed. So I don't think we're in a position to really give you any solid feedback yet.
The Senate has a mechanism to fund the pediatric cancer research that you all are also interested in by taxing nicotine vapes and nicotine pouches and things like that. You know, do you expect that there might be support for that in your caucus? I know that there's been some hesitancy with tobacco tax and cigarette tax and things like that.
Yeah. So two questions. Well, you didn't ask
They
two
put it
questions,
together.
but there's two pieces there. I think I would say. So we passed that bill out of appropriations. That'll be reflected within our budget to make sure that we have the $3 million for the pediatric research. So you'll see that reflected within our budget. They just chose to do it in a different way. My conversations with Senator Clemish is, as long, you know, the bill right now where he has it at kind of sets that new baseline of what the taxes would be on vape and pouch. I've said we'd be open to having that conversation with them once they give us that bill. Now, where we fund the pediatric cancer research from, I think that's yet to be debated, but anyone that, because I've had some folks come to like my last town hall and stuff and ask about that, and I said my expectation would be I think we'll find a way to fund it. I just don't know if we've landed on how that will be at this point. So.
You have a couple of members who are on the governor's nuclear energy task force, and that group is not going to produce a report until July. Do you anticipate taking any action on that issue this year, or is that something that the legislature will have to tackle next year?
As far as, I mean, the only bill that I'll try to reference for what I know is in the works right now. I think if I remember right, we passed a bill, and it may even be on our calendar at this point, looking at making sure that those kind of investments can happen within the state, and making sure that the sales tax on those investments can move forward. So I would say from that standpoint, we want to have that conversation in the caucus. That's why we moved it out of committee, why it's on the calendar and live at this point. We want to see what the caucus feedback is. We know and recognize that we have, just like many other states, we have tremendous demand for our energy here in the state of Iowa, and if we have a facility that's willing to make significant investments, we want to consider how we can be helpful in making sure that happens, because I think it benefits the entire state.
Has anything changed at all this week in terms of eminent domain negotiations?
We continue to have conversations internally and also with the Senate. One of the decisions that we're trying to really work through is making sure that the position that the House has taken, we feel we have led on this issue significantly. We've taken some very strong positions on it. We also don't want to negotiate against ourselves. I don't know if that's necessarily productive from our perspective. I continue to say, I think we might set a record this session for number of gaggles that I do, in which I give you guys the same answer, and I'm not doing it to be difficult, but we would love to see a bill come over from the Senate to give us a place to start from. We also are trying to be mindful where we don't want to weaken our position as a House just to continue to pass things. That's why you saw us take a very strong stance at the beginning of session, and we've been pretty clear that send us a bill back, whether it's that or something else, and we'll continue to engage.
The House Government Oversight Committee, the last 6 years, it's really focused on local governments, school districts, or in the judicial branch. We really haven't seen any hearings or investigations related to the executive branch. Do you expect that to continue, or if there is a different administration, a Democratic administration, do you anticipate that the Oversight Committee would start to do more work scrutinizing the executive branch?
I hate to even try to predict what the future may look like when it comes to any sort of different administration. Keep in mind, that is a committee that also decides. It's not directly dictated what I decide should and shouldn't be. It's a committee that has a lot of our members on it with a lot of experience, and that's decisions that they make. I think we always reserve the right to look at anything we feel that should go into the jurisdiction of government oversight, but to predict what that may look like in the future, that could be hard for me to give you any thoughts into that, Laura.
Back to the budget, the Senate's number is 9.62. I know you said you're going to still be rolling out parts of your budgets next week, but right now, as you see it, where do you think that gap is in your budget between?
Yeah, I think we're probably. I didn't get this number before I came up, so I apologize. I would just say I don't think we've been further apart in other sessions than what we are at this point in time. So I would think that would be a positive for us to be able to come to a resolution. I can't remember the exact dollar amount right off the top of my head and what that is, but I would say we're not in a position where I'm sitting here thinking, how do we ever bring these two numbers together? I feel fairly confident, and I've had conversations with Senator Clemish that we think we'll be able to resolve this because of starting in a place where we're not significantly far apart.
The governor indicated earlier this week after the Tyler Technologies presentation that she'd like to see the Department of Management's IT division kind of vet like the quality of that company first before continuing that. Do those comments give you any pause at all in pursuing a partnership or however you think?
Yeah, and I think as you've seen, and I said this earlier in the week, there's a reason why we're here towards the end of session still talking about this. As I want to remind everybody how we've gotten to this point. We've been walking through this, whether it was just me individually and then taking it to some of our committee chairs, taking it to the entirety of the caucus, trying to be methodical in our approach to this, because we also don't just want to jump in and see some flashy object to say that's going to solve all of our problems. So we've been very methodical. That's why last week we were very transparent with our Government Oversight Committee holding hearings, so Iowans and everyone in this building can see where we're at. This isn't something that we've just rushed to, and so from our perspective, we know that this company, for example, already has contracts within the state, does contracts similar to other states, and so from our perspective, appreciate the governor's feedback, but again, it ultimately will be a decision that the House decides to make if we want to move forward with utilizing that technology.
There was a strange debate over that septic amendment last night. I mean,
You are
normally,
correct.
yeah, I know you voted for the amendment, but normally we don't see that. Why did your caucus choose to kind of hash that out on the floor rather than deciding in caucus and just withdrawing the amendment if there wasn't the votes to pass it?
You're really trying to make me pull the curtain back to how the sausage is made. So ultimately, here's what we kind of reached a decision. Representative Kaufman, Leader Kaufman, and myself kind of reached a decision. We didn't know if we were going to be able to get consensus on the issue. The reason, I'll just tell you why I voted for it, and this isn't even being critical of what the other members did whether they voted for it or not. I just feel that when we're going to have those kinds of rules in place that are going to have significant impacts, if the Rules Committee leads it to a session, I think it's something the legislature should weigh in on. So it was more of a procedural procedural issue for me. That's why I did what I did. I know, and I recognize where other members were in a different position. The more I had conversations about this and never realized I would have so many, I think it's based on kind of what you have within your district, who provides what service. And so we kind of got to the point as leadership, just knowing we wouldn't reach consensus, but we wanted to at least weigh in on that rule, that we just decided to take it to the caucus, and they had to make that decision because we weren't going to get in a position where it was unanimous.
Looking at budgets for the Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, is there any thought about finding funding to continue funding the water quality sensors that will go offline this summer? I know on the Senate side there was some conversation about maybe moving things around. I think it's like $600,000 of shortfall. Is that in your budget or something you're thinking about at all?
Yeah, and I just remind everyone that we do, there are water sensors across the state, so it's not like by not doing this we wouldn't have any. If you look at what's in our original bill, and I will struggle to remember what the exact amount is, but when I was talking to Representative Mompson, one of the things that we decided to do in the groundwater protection fund that had some interest money that we've traditionally not utilized, we pulled some of that money out to continue to advance projects being deployed across the state. It may not be for that specifically at this point, but we already, we do know that there are monitors and testing going on, and we wanted to try to make sure we're putting more money online to try to address that issue of water quality, to make sure that those practices were being implemented across the state.
But on these specific monitors
That wouldn't be
it's not
reflected
in your budget.
at.
It's, Mom said put 300,000.
Yeah, I would have to double check on what that is. I know that, like I said, I know he used some of the interest funding for that. I would have to sit down and see exactly what it's related to. But I know in our conversations, our objective was if we could utilize some money that was on the side, we needed to get that towards water quality. So I'll double check with you, make sure I appreciate, look at this guy, he's been studying.
300,000 the interest from the groundwater.
Yeah.
I should have just asked.
Yeah. Can you do
I happen to sit in on the sub.
I didn't make it to that one.
I know.
All right, last one, Kate.
So, April 21st,
Oh, I thought we were gonna get out of here without that one.
budget, eminent domain, property tax, maybe the nuclear thing. Is there anything else that is a must-do before you get out?
Well, I haven't thought, the last one's gotta try to stump me, that was good. I haven't thought about what are the must-haves. I could come up with a list of a lot of things that are still in discussion, and I like Senator Clemish sending us a bill on the vaping pouch, looking at hydrogen. There's a lot of bills left out there, whether it's, I don't know if we've sat down and said, what are the must-dos? I mean, obviously property taxes is the must-do. We would love to find a solution on the eminent domain issue. I mean, that's obviously still a priority of ours, but I don't want to necessarily box us into what is and what isn't a priority. I just know there's several pieces of legislation out there that we'd like to find a resolution on yet before we leave. All right, thanks guys.